The Museum of Contemporary Art Denver presents Practicing Citizenship, a conversation series featuring artists, activists, and experts exploring civic engagement. Tonight, we bring you Native Sovereignty. And now, here's Sarah Bai, MCA Denver's Director of Programming.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Bai. I'm the Director of Programming at the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Denver, and this is Practicing Citizenship, a program series MCA Denver is producing in conjunction with the exhibition Citizenship, a Practice of Society. We come to you live every Wednesday night throughout the run of the exhibition, and tonight we present a conversation on Native sovereignty. I'm joined tonight by artists Alan Michelson and Jolene Rickard. I'll introduce Alan and Jolene in a moment, but first, this conversation is a continuation of a work, Blanket Refusal, which is on view as part of MCA Denver's citizenship exhibition. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act made all Native Americans citizens. The act, however, and perhaps unsurprisingly, rescinded treaties that Northeast Native nations held with the United States government, recognizing them as sovereign nations. And as such, it was not universally welcomed by Native peoples. Tonight, Alan and Jolene are going to use Blanket Refusal as a starting place in a larger discussion of Native sovereignty. As you may know, MCA Denver is closed currently to comply with Governor Polis's public health order. So first, I want to thank you for tuning in today to support the artists whose work we are proud to display at the museum. If you have the means, please consider donating to support the Museum of Contemporary Art Denver. We suggest a donation of $10, which is what we would normally charge for tickets. But of course, any amount helps. Thank you so much for your support. As questions come up throughout the talk tonight, you can type them in the chat at the bottom of your screen or save them for the end. As always, we want to hear your voice and we want to make this community a welcome space for conversation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Alan and Jolene. Alan Michelson is an internationally recognized New York-based artist, a curator, a writer, a lecturer, and member of the Mohawk member of the Six Nations of the Grand River. For over 25 years, he has been a leading practitioner of a socially engaged, critically aware, site-specific art grounded in local context and informed by the retrieval of repressed histories. Alan's exhibition, Wolf Nation, was recently featured as a one-person exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Jolene Rickard is an artist, a curator, and historian whose work explores the intersection of Indigenous knowledge, art, materiality, and eco-criticism with an emphasis on Haudenosaunee aesthetics. She is an associate professor in the history of art and American Indian and Indigenous Studies program at Cornell University. Jolene is from the Tuscarora Nation, Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Please welcome Alan and Jolene.
My name is Jolene Rickard, and before we begin this evening, I'd like to acknowledge the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute peoples whose territory the Museum of Denver is located within. I'm speaking to you this evening from the territory of the Tuscarora Nation, and I'm delighted and honored to be in dialogue with Alan Michelson from the brother elder nation, the Mohawk Nation. I'm in the western door of the Haudenosaunee, and Alan is currently in the southern and eastern door. And so as we move into this discussion, I'd like to make an observation. My experience with entering the field of art and then the emergent discussion of what was then called Native American art spanned from the 1970s into the 1980s. At that period of time, the discussion in North America was very much a discussion that was anchored in New York City and in the West Coast, a smattering in Chicago, a bigger discussion in Oklahoma, and then clearly a center in the American Southwest in Santa Fe. There were also sites, and so as we enter into the late 1980s, we see the emergence of a more an enriched discussion between Indigenous peoples in the United States and then Indigenous peoples in Canada. For the Haudenosaunee, this has always been a discussion because our territory spans both these two new settler states. Then in the late 1980s, we really began to see a further expansion to include Commonwealth nations, and this has been instigated by Canada's position as a Commonwealth nation. We saw a broader dialogue open up with Indigenous artists between Indigenous artists in North America and New Zealand, Aotearoa, and Australia. And so as we enter the 21st century, we now witness an expansion of this discussion to include an embrace of indigeneity globally, Indigenous artists working from both our own subjectivities as well as complicating our continued clearly emergent notions of communities and nationhood in these settler states. I think we have yet to really create a North-South dialogue. And so one of the things that I'd like for Alan, who is absolutely one of the artists that's moving around the globe, is his observation about where Indigenous art is located within the broader discussion of contemporary art globally. So, Nyawa, Alan.
Thanks, Jolene. Well, maybe the best way to start would be with our first slide. Last year, I was invited by a Venetian arts organization, Zueka Projects, to participate in a two-person exhibition that coincided with the Venice Biennale. And the curatorial prompt was to look at Venice as a site of European exploration, which it was early on in the 15th and 16th century, a center of map making and navigation and things like that. And research has been part of my practice forever, really. And so this was an invitation that was very easy to accept and to embrace. You know, since the internet and digitization, the archive has become extremely accessible. You know, more so than it's ever been. It's also, if you work with it for a while, especially if you're an Indigenous person, you realize very quickly how biased it is. You know, that it's created out of certain sorts of Eurocentric notions and doctrines that are tough to take. So part of my project has been to use the archive against itself for its sort of evidentiary aspects, to deconstruct and to counter its destructive myths and narratives with another perspective. So for this piece, I came across an illustration of an early atlas showing the Copernican universe, which was revolutionary in its time. The idea that the sun, not the Earth, was the center of the universe. And the illustration depicted a central sun and then 4 globes that it was illuminating. And it just struck me that image, and I thought, well, I can do that with video. And so I found 4 spheres and made 4 videos to project onto them in a sequence. And this piece was really constructed from the archive, from just dozens and dozens of images that include maps and paintings and even recordings. And so I thought maybe it's best to move on to the next slide, showing the sort of scale of the work. You can see the people in the gallery. And again, there were 4 videos, and they're interrelated, but I think we only really have time for one. So we're going to show the second one, which is sort of the work is called, by the way, the work is called Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, Theater of the World. And this video or clip we're going to see is subtitled War Dance. So can we have that clip, please?
We will offer them our religion, our education, our life ways, in order to help them achieve our level of civilization and thus raise them and all their white brothers up from their savage and unhappy state.
We know that this is a 300-year-old problem, and the government refuses to fix it. The Longhouse people have been saying, we want to be part of the solution, but we are excluded.
So it's interesting because this brings into a number of questions for me. The question of legibility. Does the audience recognize the symbolism you're using, the retrieval from the archive? At the center of this is, of course, the question of sovereignty and citizenship. And so I guess I'll make an observation about sovereignty in that I have argued and continue to argue that we use sovereignty in our communities in a way very different than has been kind of authored in the West. And I'm just wondering, Alan, if you could make a comment about this to just really begin to open up and thread through our dialogue this evening thoughts about sovereignty.
Yes, well, you wrote a beautiful piece some time ago in which you talked about visual sovereignty. And so we borrow a lot from, you know, the non-Haudenosaunee world. And we are constantly translating between worlds. And I think the concept of sovereignty is one that we've learned to translate, but not to let go of our own ideas about it, philosophy. You know, the Haudenosaunee, for people who aren't familiar with us, also known as the Six Nations or the Iroquois Confederacy, are a confederacy of 6 nations that have a very sophisticated political and cultural life that dates back more than 1,000 years in the Northeast. And I'd like to respond to that a little more a little bit later, but I'd like to sort of use some slides to sort of tell the story as well.
Yeah, no, I think the next one is the perfect demonstration of this idea.
Yeah, so holding on to your sovereignty when you're in the way of land-hungry settlers is not an easy thing. And the fact that we've actually survived on some of our territory is quite a feat. You can see from this map that our historic territory was quite large. You can even see some figures down there of millions of acres. And you can see what once was and what is now. So from 2.6 million acres the Onondaga Nation had, it's down to 7,300. And those sorts of figures could be demonstrated when you go across the country and you see how Indian country was turned into states, territory states in the United States. And you can see from this map that that we're now somewhat scattered across this artificial border, the Canadian-US border, which landed on our territory, into these pretty tiny reserves. The one that's over, I can't actually point to it, but if you look just sort of west of the Niagara Peninsula, you'll see Six Nations, and it's the largest reserve in Canada, but you can see that it's quite small. I'd like to move on to the next one, and this is an interesting animated map. This is showing our original territory, and then the blue is the French Empire in North America. The trade in furs caused all sorts of disruptions, including things called the Beaver Wars. And you can see that the Six Nations expanded as well. This is a bit misleading because it's not a direct sort of takeover. It's a different sort of relationship. But you can see the red, which is the British colonies, and in this short period, you can see all that movement. Can we go to the next one, because the next one takes us from the end of what's called the French and Indian War, 50 years into the early years of the United States Republic.
And so it was during this time in the formation of the United States that the Haudenosaunee played a really significant role in brokering relationships, first in the French and Indian War, and then with the British. And once the emergent United States began to feel that the British were no longer a threat, that's when the dynamic changed for the Haudenosaunee. And it's interesting because I think that most of the world, most of the public really understands west of the Mississippi Native histories and located within the Lakota, Nakota, Dakota territories. And I argue that understanding of Indigenous history is really based on the visibility that is available through the camera. Mm-hmm. And so our work is located at the formation of the United States, which is, I would argue, the least understood dynamic between a settler state and an indigenous peoples. And yet that's where your work is really, focused. And so in a sense, your work is always in some way dependent on the curiosity of the observer, of the audience, to want to know more. And
yes, I think art always needs attractors, or people don't give it the time of day. So you're absolutely right, Jolene. The whole sort of notion of Indianness is associated with the Western United States and the Plains, the figure of the Plains Indian. And you're right that was also during a time when photography and newspapers and so forth were spreading all this stereotypical imagery that has really permeated and penetrated the culture very deeply. But what I'm interested in is the sort of the original West, which was our territory, and the policies that were adopted dealing with us, like you said, like first having nation-to-nation relations, really for a couple hundred years until we were no longer a military threat, and then suddenly, and this was a formula that was enacted as the country expanded west. There was basically a formula to it, and it was one that I go into a little bit later in a piece. We're going to talk about my piece called Onondaga. But I'd like to talk about. Could we get to the next slide? Because I'd like to talk about one of our strongest cultural features, which is diplomacy and political sophistication, and the fact that we conduct our diplomacy with certain rituals and protocols. And a major one is wampum and wampum belts. And these are belts woven out of shell beads and made into these long format belts that you can see that they're oriented horizontally in terms of their design, in terms of their reading their story in a way, their pictures. But they're actually when they're performed, when they're accompanying certain sorts of speech, they're actually held vertically by the speaker. And this is actually my cousin Rick at one of the readings of the Great Law, which is one of our sort of our Constitution, referring to these wampum belts. Could we go to the next slide?
I'd just like to note that those belts are reproductions of glass beads, and this is actual quagga shell in the belt that represents the 5 nations.
Absolutely. So this is a very old and storied belt that's called the Hiawatha belt. And the Haudenosaunee were originally 5 nations and conceived themselves as a longhouse, which is the original architecture that we had. Matrilineal, matrilocal, multifamily dwellings. And so we conceived of our territory as this communal house, and the Mohawks were the easternmost and keepers of the eastern door, as you pointed out, and the Seneca, the keepers of the western door, and the Onondagas were the fire keepers in the center, sort of our capital. And it's symbolized by this, sort of symbol of a white pine, the great white.
It's been suggested that this can be a white pine, but it can also represent, if it's flipped the other way, it can also represent a heart. And so there is an interesting argument that that it contains both of those symbols.
Oh, that's great. Wampum just, it's such a profound thing to me. It's at once this vehicle of diplomacy. It's very political. It's also very cultural, the way that it's constructed from nature, from these beautiful permanent sort of shiny materials of shells. And they're very hard to construct. It was very hard to make these beads, and it was very hard. There's hundreds of beads in any belt, and so they were painstakingly put together. And they're also amazing works of art. So it's rare that you have all those things at once, but I think that is indicative of our culture, which is somehow very integrative. It's one where many things come together in a very economy of sort of means and gesture. And so I was inspired. Can we go to the next slide? I was inspired to do a sort of homage to the Hiawatha wampum in the form of a lightbox installation. I shot this panoramic photograph of the banks of the Grand at 6 Nations. We're looking from the non-native township toward Six Nations. And in fact, we're looking at a piece of land that had been in my family for generations. It had been my great-grandfather's farm at one time. And so that was part of a residency I had one summer at the cultural center that's associated with the reserve in Brantford, Ontario. And I had the idea to do another piece that was also a river piece that involved another wampum and wampum design and another wampum symbol. Could we go on to the next one? Now this one is based on a very important wampum called the Guswenta, or the two-row wampum, and it was put together in 1613 to embody an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch and other Europeans who were moving into our territory at that time. And the idea was, it was trying to depict in two purple rows against a white field the parallel and sort of equal and coexisting path of two vessels on a river. You could say one of our canoes and one of their sailing ships. And the idea was that we would chart parallel, respectful courses and not try to get in each other's vessels or try to steer each other's courses or interfere at all. So it's basically our first treaty, and it was one of mutual coexistence, peace and respect. And so what I was interested in at the time was how the Grand River was actually functioning instead of being a vehicle of sort of sociability, which it was in our culture. Rivers were the highways in our traditional culture, but rivers also can become boundaries, and the Grand River became a sort of moat or a fence that separated the Six Nations Reserve from the non-native townships on the other side. So I shot, using 4 cameras, I shot panoramic video from a dinner cruise boat on the Grand that passes through our reserve territory in its course. And I'd like to show a clip. You can see that it's a pretty large work. This is a still of it at the National Gallery of Canada. It's about 50 feet long by about 8 feet high. So you're going to see a very tiny version of just a piece of it. Can we go to that, please?
Longhouse was at Middleport, and of course into Middleport come the Hagers. The Hagers were basically fundamentalists. The Longhouse people would have gone and would perform their ceremonies out of the Longhouse. At one particular time, they were performing the white dog ceremony. And of course, they sacrifice the dog and leave it behind the Longhouse, and the Hagers would come and destroy it. And so tensions were breaking out for someone being killed. And as a result of that, the Onondagas packed up and moved to this side of the river. And basically left their Longhouse there, and it fell into disrepair. There are now people living on that original site of the village. But even before it was Onondaga Village, it was neutral Iroquoian site as well. At one point in time, there were 5,000 people living on that site. So you cannot dig too deep in that ground. You would be turning up parts of a house. At Middleport, the Department of Highway discovered a man buried inside a longhouse. And so we removed it because we could not drive over him every day. But every time I drive on that part of the highway, I think of all the people that run over basic injuries.
Right now, you'll see a little white church.
So it's interesting, Alan, because one of the things that art does is it helps us to see things in new ways. And it's interesting to work with our cultural patrimony, the wampum, because I think that there's a responsibility with it. And when I look at this piece, what it reminds me of is that how wampum is part of the intergenerational exchange of knowledge, which is, the way in which our people have come into the 21st century as Haudenosaunee. And so you add movement in a way to the belt, which itself is a static object as a material object. But in this context, you push it to really communicate on this other level that it's part of our culture that we speak through. So you've given it voice and movement, and and so I view your work as having multiple responsibilities, and that for people that know nothing about this history, it's an introduction of this idea to them. But then for people that are deeply invested in it, it provokes this other idea that I just expressed. And I don't, I think that this, and so there are multiple levels of responsibility in this art. And it's interesting because I think that we are now just beginning to enter a phase in these discussions where people are looking at Indigenous art and this work, and they're asking if they really understand it. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe share some of your thoughts around the reception of some of the work that you've done.
Yes, well, I think certain things can translate without express insider knowledge. When I've traveled through Italy and have gone to some of these Duomos, these beautiful cathedrals, I have no idea of the story of the saints that are being depicted in the frescoes and on the walls, but I can get the idea. I can get reverence, or I can get a story that is sort of being depicted in some way. And I think like with this one, I found that panoramic format suits me very well. Maybe I lifted it in a way from wampum, but I was also interested in it, in its sort of Western form as well. And the reason that I think it's a good form for this kind of thing is because you can't really own it in the way that you can own a smaller sort of picture. It forces a shift in perspective, literally a shift in perspective, and from having done more than one, and having worked on a sort of monumental scale more than once, in this one I did something with the sound that I think was also similar, which is, since I had 4 stereo soundtracks to play with, I recorded not only the sounds of the dinner cruise, but the captain, the amplified voice of the captain giving the tour, but I invited elders at 6 Nations to come to the radio station and just to speak about the river, anything they wanted to say. And so when you go into this installation, you sort of are faced with a bit of a cacophony, as you just got an idea of in that brief clip. And I think people become sort of intrigued by that and try to make sense of it. And I think that's what I think that's what a sort of art that does sort of tap somebody in the shoulder does. that it sort of draws you in, and it draws you into sort of figuring it out on some level. And I think if you even heard in that clip, we heard Tom Hill, who used to be the director of the museum at the Woodland Cultural Center, talking about just his daily drive and how he was feeling like he was driving over, you know, a burial site. And I think so that is something that I think anyone can sort of put together in terms of the story that this is sort of based on.
So let's shift from this piece, which really introduces the impact of contact, the epistemological divide between Indigenous peoples and settlers. And let's deal directly now with this issue of citizenship in your next work.
Sure. Yeah, could we have the next slide? Okay, so as I said, we had a lot of territory at one time, and territory that the Canadian-U.S. border and state borders all landed on. And I was commissioned to do a permanent public artwork for the U.S. Land Port of Entry in Messina, New York, in 2006. This is the port. It was designed by Smith, Miller, and Hawkinson, a New York architectural firm, and it was you know one of the buildings that was built after 9/11, and it was built in a very paranoid sort of form of architecture where there was bulletproof glass and things like that. It was very hard to site a work there, and the only public area was a lobby where, you know, buses are, you know, people crossing the border on buses have to get out and get processed. And also, if you get pulled over and you're in trouble, it sort of acts like a police station. So anyways, can we have that map again? I just want to show that the border is quite complex. The green area is Cornwall Island, which is technically part of Akwesasne territory, Akwesasne Mohawk territory. And the International Bridge runs across it from the Ontario mainland. So the reserves are sort of split up into Akwesasne on the Canadian side and the St. Regis Mohawk Reserve on the New York side. And so we have a jurisdictional tangle here and nightmare. We have New York State, we have the province of Quebec, and we have the province of Ontario, all with their own, you know, legal apparatus, and we have our own at the same time. And in a way, you could say that this border station is really against the Jay Treaty, because in 1791, I think it was, the United States made a treaty with Native, a treaty that was basically saying that a Native people would be able to pass freely with their goods over this border. And that's far from the situation at the border, and has been that way for quite a while. So I was trying to figure out what I could do in this very complex border. And like I do sometimes, I got out in a boat and I sailed around, literally sailed around Cornwall Island where the bridge is located. And I decided to do a work that would encompass that complexity of geography and landscape and jurisdiction in a work called Third Bank of the River. Can we have the next one? Yeah, so here's it installed. It's a glass artwork. It's etched glass. It's basically about 40 feet long, almost 6 feet high. It's in 10 sections. And picture a purple glass that has been nicked, you know, through a dot screen. So everything that you're seeing is white is actually a nick in the glass that's been done through a computerized dot matrix. Anyways, it's encompassing about 3 miles of shoreline at the crossing. So the topmost layer, maybe we can have the next slide because you can see it from both sides. You can see the bridges here. So the topmost layer is New York State, and then the river part is the south channel of the St. Lawrence River. And upside down, underneath, facing the New York shoreline, and upside down is the southern shoreline of Cornwall Island, of again Akwesasne Mohawk territory. And then if you move further down, you get the northern shore of the island, and then finally upside down, with that little section of bridge, you're seeing the Ontario mainland, Cornwall, Ontario mainland. So in a way, this replicates what you've just done. If you happen to be in that lobby, you've just crossed one way or another. But it also, in a way, it sort of places, you could say almost like a Haudenosaunee flag in an American in an American outpost of some kind. It's
or our wampum.
Yes, it's putting our wampum and that, and again trying to insist upon the notion of nation to nation and equality and coexistence, rather than this this unequal relationship of control and domination.
Yeah, well, I love the irony of this piece, that one of the few ways that you get to enjoy it is if you're detained.
Yes. You wouldn't believe some of the actual rooms in this installation. Yeah.
Border checkpoints in North America. It's here, and people really don't recognize it in this way. And so I want to be sure that we get to this next piece, Alan, because it's a really important, again, foundational history of the emergence of the United States. And I think that your use of Hanut Nagayas, which is, of course, the name that the Onondagas or the Senecas gave to George Washington because of his orders to commit a genocide against the Haudenosaunee people after the American Revolution. And it was clearly a land grab that was based on a burnt earth campaign in the heartland of Haudenosaunee territory. And so
yes, that's right. You know, in 2018, I finished a permanent a monument in Richmond, Virginia, at the state capitol, the capitol designed by Thomas Jefferson, honoring Virginia's native nations, or the native nations of the land that eventually became Virginia. And you know, Richmond was the site of all this monument, the center of all this monument controversy, with its, you know, numerous statues of Confederate generals and heroes and white supremacists. And there were statues like that right at the state capitol. You know, Stonewall Jackson, and a doctor who had been a eugenicist sort of type. And so working at, you know, in that, working there got me sort of riled up even before this monument controversy. And I was moved to do something about the fact that in 2018, we saw the next year, 2019, being the 240th anniversary of the Sullivan expedition, or the Sullivan campaign, which was that burnt, scorched earth campaign that George Washington ordered, one of the most costly and largest campaigns of the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, which basically literally burned us out of our territories. And so I got a replica bust of Washington, actually one that was originally done by Houdin from Life, and mounted it on a antique surveyor's tripod, because Washington didn't go to college but was trained as a surveyor, and always had his eye on land, on native land. When he was 11, his father died, and he inherited a 180-acre farm. When he died, he had over 55,000 acres of once native land. And so I wanted to mark this in a work, and having just you know, thought about the way that history is a sort of projection by the dominant culture. It's a projection of all sorts of myths and inaccuracies. I thought it I thought it'd be interesting if I could somehow commemorate this anniversary, which is never taught in any of the schools. Native New Yorkers have no idea that most of their state was once our territory, and how it got to get there. Now, you know,
I would interject that most of the United States has no idea that the United States was all of indigenous territories. So
some billions of acres. But in any case, you know, we've talked about colonization, you and I, Jolene, and how it really is foundational to the Republic. And you know, a lot has been, you know, sort of taught and written about enslavement or slavery. And not enough has been, you know, touched on in terms of indigenous dispossession. And if you think about it, there's a way in which enslavement is sort of easy to picture in a way. You can imagine yourself in chains. You can imagine yourself being forced to live in inhuman conditions and to be abused. But it's harder to picture in your mind losing your homeland. And with indigenous people, it's more than just acreage. It's you know, it's a much deeper connection. So I'm trying to find a way, and I'm still trying to find a way to get that across, to really sort of picture dispossession. And so can we get to the next slide? We'll show this brief clip of this work, Onondaga's Town Destroyer. Those are actually Washington's orders calling for the devastation of the country of the Six Nations.
Onondagaños. Onondagaños.
Onondaga.
There was a huge, you know, series of land grabs after the defeat of the British and the betrayal by the British at the Treaty of Paris, which gave away all this land that was not the Brits to give away.
So in the US legal system, the US gave itself plenary power in our communities. And I think this is tied to the imposition of citizenship, which I think is, you know, at the center of this next series that you've put together for us, Alan. Did you want to move to the next stage?
Yeah, let's move to blanket refusal. Oh, sorry. Well, why don't we just briefly just want to say that's the those are some chiefs of the Six Nations, and they're holding. You can see they're holding wampum belts, a huge amount of wampum belts. These wampum belts were later confiscated illegally by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police when they sort of invaded and occupied Six Nations in the early 1920s.
And so this is a photograph of this with Diskahe, who is the title holder, the person, Levi General here, condoled chief in the Confederacy. And it's taken actually in Switzerland on the occasion of the Confederacy's attempt to seek international recognition as an autochthonous nation. Although our efforts were not successful at this period of time, it is recognized as one of the earliest attempts by Indigenous peoples to claim this space internationally.
Can we have the next one?
And so this is actually a photograph of members of the Indian Defense League of America, which was a pan-Indigenous group that was formed around defending the Jay Treaty. And it was based on the restrictions and limitations that had occurred in the border in the early part of the 20th century, the US-Canadian border. And so maybe one of the reasons why Alan invited me this afternoon or this evening is because my grandfather, Clinton Rickard, is actually one of the founders of the IDLA and is marching in this piece just in front of the, which is the British flag. And so in the IDLA, I grew up with the understanding that when our people, they have marched across the border as a demonstration of our right to move freely in our homelands. And when we march from Canada into the United States or from, this is all within our territory, but across these settler states, when we're marching into the United States, it's actually a celebration of the Jay Treaty because the Jay Treaty is actually recognized by the United States, which empowers Indigenous peoples from Canada to actually come into the United States and work without needing the kinds of documentation that other arrivants need. But when we march from the United States into Canada, we call it a commemoration because Canada has yet to pick up what we call the trust responsibility. And, because it was originally an agreement that was made with Great Britain and Canada has yet to pick this up. And so although Canada does appear to have a friendlier cultural face in the global setting, for Indigenous peoples, it's still a very compromised and ongoing colonial state. And I think, Alan, that's at the core of many of the statements in your work. It's that while the world is focused on racism, your work recognizes the deepest root of coloniality as the platform that empowers ongoing racism.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Can we have the next one? And this is a successor to that embassy by Descahe, a Levi general, who did it in the 1920s. This is the delegation in 1977 to the UN to discuss these issues. And at the time, they would only title the conference something to do with Indigenous populations. They wouldn't call us people or peoples because they were afraid of the implications of that, especially the United States, Canada, and Australia, those countries, the ones who, like the US, didn't sign the treaty about genocide, I think until, was it the 1980s or something, and resisted the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. So this has been a ongoing process. This is not something that just came about over the last 10 or 20 years. We've been fighting for trying to assert and fight for our sovereignty ever since it was diminished. We've never just accepted these things passively. But when you're, vastly outnumbered and outgunned and eventually manipulated past all understanding, things like that happen. And I'm just so proud of the way that our people have been resisting all this and continue to resist all this. And so I was motivated when invited to do the citizenship show. Can we have the next one? Yeah, to do this piece because refusal is actually a very powerful instrument. It's the instrument of civil disobedience. It's the instrument when when one's government or when laws are applied, incorrectly, or laws are just made up, which is very much the case in Indigenous law in the United States. Most of it's just resting on this medieval document called the Doctrine of Christian Discovery, which is absurd in its face, that Christian nations had a greater right to our territory than we did. So I found this letter from the Onondaga chiefs to Calvin Coolidge, who was president at the time of the Citizenship Act. And I was just thinking about how, the way that English, we've all sort of learned English, and then English became a lingua franca that could communicate intertribally. So we've been able to communicate with our brothers and sisters across Turtle Island, across North America, partially because of that, and partially because the way that we've adapted technologies like letter writing and typewriters and computers and things like that. So these have been empowering things. And so I wanted to celebrate this very strong, powerful letter where these chiefs wrote right to the president, like leader to leader, basically saying thanks but no thanks for this unilateral award of citizenship. And they're basically reminding the United States of the treaties that it holds with us and is supposed to continue to hold with us. And it basically politely refuses citizenship on the basis that we're already citizens of our own nation.
And so we base this claim on 3 treaties, and it's the Treaty of Fort Stanwix of 1784, Treaty of Fort Hammond, 1789, and then the Treaty of Canandaigua, 1794. And it's actually because of the Treaty of Canandaigua that the leaders in the chiefs and clan mothers in our communities do not go to the courts. They go directly to Onondaga's office. And that's why it was directed to the president, because that's what it says in the Treaty of Canandaigua, that that's a nation-to-nation dialogue. And so, that's what I think is embedded in this letter, is that ongoing understanding and practice. And I think, by bringing it forward and shining a light on this, Alan, it really brings it to another generation and forces us to, as an artist, as a cultural historian, it isn't in our education to have to understand Indian law, Native law, but you need to understand it, and actually in order to really continue to engage with these relationships. And so I got very excited when I saw this piece, Oh,
that's great. Yeah, so I wanted to bring it forward, like you said, and sort of enlarge it. And I just, I thought of the idea that this was a blanket grant of citizenship, and I just thought it was a blanket refusal, and then I just thought blanket. So, had these silk screened onto, 2 blankets that, again, bringing out that 2-row aspect to try to, again, another prod, another reminder, we're actually nation to nation. We're not your wards, we're not your domestic dependent anything, and never have been, it's your fantasy that we are.
And so I'm wondering, Alan, because I'm often beaten back by legal historians who say, oh, but you're domestic dependence, you're quasi-sovereign. And I said, well, no, I'm not. That's not what I was raised with. We're a sovereign people. We've never been defeated. There's never been, as Haudenosaunee, there's never been a declaration that we have accepted defeat. And so maybe we could spend the last few minutes, you kind of just spinning for us about what you imagine the future to be.
Well, just as you were saying that, I was just thinking about law and how saying something is so doesn't make it so. I think we've really got a big dose of that lately in the United States from the president. Just merely saying something does not make it so. And so when I hate to say this, but when Ruth Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion decision against Sherrill versus Oneida Nation, that was also a made up a sort of application of lashes of a legal principle, that she apparently later regretted. And I was fascinated by what you were telling me that recently at Cornell, where you teach, there was a controversy with the naming of the dorm or naming of the building after Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
I mean, yeah, working at Cornell, in the heartland of the Gayacono or the Cayuga people, this is who this ruling has impacted in a devastating way. And, Cornell actually did the right thing years ago and actually put a student residence on campus called Oguego. And most recently, there was a discussion about potentially naming a building after Ruth Bader Ginsburg that would be very close in proximity to Oguego. And we had to really, people have a great deal of respect for the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was, a graduate of Cornell. And so, but at the same period of time, we had to rise up and say, yes, but you have to understand how she, impacted Haudenosaunee peoples, and you have to respect our space as well. And it's interesting because it's never become a controversy, and our colleagues thus far have understood. And they're still going to name a building after her, but it's not going to be in direct, it's not going to be, right next to Oguego. And so, but I think in the settler space that we're in now, these are always the complications that we're negotiating. And in a sense, when I feel like when, you make work and you're putting it in these spaces, it's that, you're continuing to negotiate that space, that I think people are not clear about their relationship. I think people in North America are not clear about our position as Indigenous peoples, that, we're not going to recede into a past. And so I don't know how you see it, Alan, but that's the way that I see it, that it's a kind of marker,
I agree. And I want to go back to your essay and your terminology of visual sovereignty, because I think that art is a space that is really not, it's a space that can be an ethical space. It's a space that can make room for a work like Blanket Refusal, whereas 30, 40 years of court cases couldn't make that statement.
Right.
So, having the ability to enforce a fiction does not make you a democratic nation.
Yeah.
So I think people have to really start thinking about, how democratic do they really want to be, and how honorable, in its dealings, the United States wants to be, because it's got a long way to go with its native peoples.
Yes.
And it can't just keep fronting this, exceptionalism, while, at the same time, leaving Native people in this terrible state. Just look at the pandemic, and our people were victims of countless pandemics brought over by Europeans.
This is the first pandemic we've dealt with. Yes.
Yes, this is not the first, and it's also one in which Native people are suffering the most, of course. So the infection rate, I believe, in the Navajo Hopi area was the worst maybe in the world. And so these are things that need to be addressed. And if they're not getting their day in court, then they have to get their day in the museum. And I'm just lucky that that my work is able to travel and to broadcast whatever it broadcasts, that there's a platform for this sort of resistance and this sort of questioning.
Well, I would say resistance, but I would also say affirmative assertion,
Yes.
And so I think that, the refusal, blanket refusal, has lots of different entry points and can be read from different perspectives. And I think about how it impacts the coming generations in our own communities. And so this is a piece that I think is a way to open up the discussion about how courageous our ancestors have been and continue to be. And I was thinking about this today, that, who were these people? What were they what were they thinking about, that they had the courage and the determination to resist that prize that everybody else in the world wanted, to be a citizen in the United States, and to say, that is not our future. Our future is to continue to maintain our own notion of place, nation, community, and
yes, our nationhood predated the United States.
Yes,
our citizenship or membership or whatever you want to call it predates any other membership or any other citizenship. And was it your grandfather who said, how can you be a citizen of a country that you have of a nation that you have a treaty with?
Yeah. That's it. They were, but that's who that generation was. And it was, they were a fight. You might say his actual biography is called The Fighting Tuscarora. And, they had to stand up and fight this way in order to continue to make a space for us today. And I think that, some of, the protests that have happened around the country and the world are the only means necessary, but I think that I also appreciate working at this from multiple perspectives, creating space in a museum, opening up intellectual space, opening up dialogue. I mean, we have to remain hopeful that we can create allyship, first in the arts, of course, and, maybe it'll go a little larger, I guess,
Well, I think it's a dynamic time, and I think we've come a distance, and I think it is a hopeful time in terms of that, because I think Indigenous contemporary art is on the radar finally, and I just hope that it doesn't just sort of, turn into the usual sort of tokenship situation, and that its beauty and its messages, which are, I think, very strong and needed right now, get a hearing, get a viewing.
Well, I hope people will take a look at your website, because you've got an amazing array of work, and we've just focused very narrowly, in a sense, today on this aspect of of the idea of citizenship and how we frame it within our territories and how we resisted it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll just share with you a little exercise that we do here at Tuscarora. When my sister was the culture teacher at the Tuscarora School here in our territory, one of the field trips that she would take her students on was a trip across the border between the US and Canada within our territories. And when the border guards got on the bus and they said, "What's your citizenship?" And she was always most proud when her little kindergartners would say, "Tuscarora Nation, Haudenosaunee, North American Native," because that's, you know, it takes a lot of courage to stare those officials in the face and declare our insistence upon our space, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I think in a way that's what your work is doing.
Well, that's a beautiful story and a great place to end our conversation. I'm so very grateful for you agreeing to do this, and we've known each other a long time, and it's great to have this conversation in public with you.
Well, I look forward to the next piece. Do it again.
Great.
Well, I want to thank Alan and Jolene for being here, and I want to thank you for watching us at home tonight for this conversation. We will be back next Wednesday with Alexandra Bell in conversation with Lee Rayford about implicit racial bias in the media. Thank you for tuning in, and have a great night.